Good evening, everyone, from the National Liberal Club, Whitehall, London. Tonight's event is the first of a series of fireside chats hosted by the new Defence and Security Circle. My name is Noel Hadjimichael, and I'm the chair of the Circle, and I'm really thrilled to be welcoming you all here today. Those socially distanced in the David Lloyd George room upstairs, and those joining us, the many of them, via Zoom, especially those from the US, Canada, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Australia. The establishment of the Circle allows the NLC to host stimulating discussions on defence and security topics of current and of future impact. And for this, our inaugural event, we're incredibly lucky to have two leading experts here with us tonight. Elizabeth Braw, a recognised voice in the field of hybrid and grey zone warfare, is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, Washington. She's a former senior fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, where she excelled and founded its modern deterrence project. She's also the host of the high-profile On the Cusp podcast, dealing with key defence and security challenges. Elizabeth will be speaking with Lynn O'Donnell, a high-profile London-based journalist, war correspondent and author. Lynn is the host of the War podcast and a recent graduate of the War Studies program at KCL. Before I hand over to Lynn, let me just mention a couple of housekeeping matters. Firstly, I want to let everyone know that we're recording this session for the NLC's YouTube channel. Secondly, for those on Zoom, you can use the chat function for Q&A in the same way as those in the David Lloyd George room will use the lectern. Finally, may I let you know that the Defence and Security Circle is just one of over a dozen associated groups of the club. Tonight's audience may be interested to know that we have a military history group recently started by Staff Sergeant Paul Hill, and our business forum tomorrow night will be running a session on how to use Zoom at your best. It's literally a survival kit item for anybody. Importantly, this is a special event because this circle wants to make a difference to both the club, its members, and our very diverse range of guests. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Lynn O'Donnell for tonight's fireside chat.
We can be heard. Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lynn O'Donnell. This is Elizabeth Braw. We haven't met before. This is the first time that we've met, but we've had a chat. We talked yesterday on the phone quite extensively, and we have similar interests. And I wanted to start with something that you wrote an article about recently, which was Jens Stoltenberg's speech in Bratislava. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. So he gave a speech in which he acknowledged that war is no longer confined to the battlefield, and he recognised the vulnerabilities of everything that we take for granted, electricity and power grids, gas supplies, GPS, telecommunications, our ports, and he called for strong societies. He said our militaries cannot be strong if our societies are weak, so our first line of defence must be strong societies. Elizabeth, are our societies weak?
They are, and it's nobody's fault. It's just the reality of 30 years, and indeed more than 30 years of peace in most of our countries. If we look at Western Europe in particular, we have been extremely lucky to not have to worry about national security for decades now. And yes, during the Cold War, we did have to worry a little bit about a nuclear war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, but as part of everyday life, it just wasn't something that most people worried about. They could go about their life as if everything was fine. And what's changing now is that contrary to belief in the 90s, when it was predicted that we'd live peacefully ever after, what we're seeing now is that countries compete for power, and they do so not through military aggression with one another. I'm talking about the developed world, but by subversion of the other side. So, for example, if another country wanted to harm this country, they may, for example, engage in disinformation, they may engage in cyber attacks, they may even engage in targeted assassinations, and all of that has happened. And so that's something, especially cyber attacks and disinformation, and I should add subversive business practices, that's something where all of us are influenced by it, because if the internet were to go down, this call would end immediately. Right. And if power went out, it would be charming for half an hour, then it would be disastrous, and so forth. Yeah. So it is something that is happening, and that really affects every single one of us.
But that puts us into a post-Westphalian reality, doesn't it? So are we now in a state of perpetual war? What does modern warfare look like to you?
We are not in a state of perpetual war, but we're in a state of perpetual subversion, and I think it's important not to assume that there is a Russian behind everything that goes wrong in our societies. We do enough ourselves to make things go wrong in our societies, but what we should remember is that a liberal democracy, which is the way of life that we like and enjoy so much, is vulnerable because it's so open, and the way in which our adversaries can exploit that and are exploiting that is by taking advantage of the many opportunities that open society offers. And the only way to limit the risk of that, or the effects of that, is for us all to do our part to keep society safe, because pulling up the drawbridge is just not an option. Even if we wanted to withdraw from globalization, we as Western countries, it wouldn't work.
Well, we'll get on to the enemy within, and are we our own worst enemies in a little bit. But you mentioned disinformation, which I think is one of the biggest big guns of the new reality that we're now living in. How do you see this playing out in the context of the US elections? Less than 2 weeks to go. It's been called one of the most important in the country's history. It'll affect the entire world. What's the playbook here for you?
So disinformation is something that Americans discovered apparently in 2016, even though other countries have experienced it and battled it for much longer. For example, the Baltic states. But it really came to the forefront with that election in 2016, when most Americans discovered for the first time that, oh, maybe there are countries trying to influence our society, and maybe we need to pay more attention ourselves to what we share and what we read and what we share, to make sure that we are not helping another country cause harm to our country. So I think there is a risk if we think that that's the only way in which Russia or other countries will try to harm our countries, and to then only measure disinformation and say, well, it wasn't so bad this year, I guess it's declining. Like Sun Tzu, Putin, and indeed President Xi of China, they are not so foolish as to think that they can try the same trick twice. They will try something different, which we saw after Ukraine, for example. Russia in 2014, as we all know, annexed Crimea and then engaged in hybrid war against Ukraine. Everybody predicted that the Baltic states would be next and that Russia would seize a part of Estonia and then engage in hybrid warfare. Instead, Russia did nothing in Estonia, well, apart from the usual disinformation, a little bit of cyber attacks, and instead it went to Syria. So I think it just demonstrates how Putin is always one step ahead, and we say, oh, we should counter that next time. No, we should counter whatever he thinks up next that time. And that's the difficulty of being the defender, because I don't want to say the offender, but the country wishing to do harm always has the advantage of the initiative.
Have we been too late coming to that realization?
We have, simply because we live, we believe in globalization, we believe in the level playing field, and we believe that once countries join the globalized world, they become like us. And that's our fallacy, that we think that every country would want to become like us. What if they just want to be part of the globalized world, and maintain their system, their ideology, their way of life? And I think that's the arrogance of the West, that we assume that, oh, once people discover our way of life, they'll want to become like us. No. And we see that with extremists at home, and we see it with other countries, and we just have to recognize and we have to recognize that that's the reality. Not everybody wants to be like us, and in fact, some people may want to harm us. And we have to be a little bit muscular in helping maintain and protect the way of life that we ourselves have built up and love.
Indeed, maybe that's a legacy of colonialism that's hard to shake. We're seeing that in this country at the moment. I think it's all about our own identity, isn't it, and where that comes from and where it goes to. But if you're looking specifically, getting back to the US and the election and the build up to it, because it's coming very soon and anything could happen, as we saw last time round, the last 11 to 14 days were pivotal in the change in sentiment and the result. Was it yesterday or the day before, the New York Post ran a story purportedly about Joe Biden's son's business dealings in Ukraine and whether or not the Democratic candidate had helped him, whatever. It turns out that some of the people who were involved in that story didn't even want to be identified with it. They wouldn't put their bylines on it. This is a newspaper that is owned by Rupert Murdoch, as is Fox News. Do we also have to deal with the enemy within as well as the enemy without? Or is it all of a piece? It's not always of a piece, but sometimes the two come together. And I'm not saying that the New York Post deliberately worked with Russia to smear a presidential candidate. I think that will have to be investigated. But I think what's becoming clear is that the tabloid way of life is an extremely dangerous path to pursue, and the tabloid way of reporting is an extremely dangerous path to pursue in an era of disinformation, because what in the past could have just been sort of a juicy scoop that may or may not have been correct can now be a scoop that has been planted by another country. And yes, that happened during the Cold War as well, that intelligence agencies fed scoops to various journalists, including tabloid journalists. But now it's so much more dangerous, because a scoop, a false or a correct one, can travel so fast, so quickly. And as we all know, what was it Churchill used to say when falsehoods already gone all around the world before the truth catches up.
Exactly. I should know what it was he said, because he is hangs on the big picture here in the front. Exactly. In the entrance of this distinguished
probably
club.
Painted before he said that, but anyway, he was a young Winston there.
Well, he was still wise at a young age.
Well, you talked before about strengthening civil participation. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring up the enemy within is because we seem to be so, as Western, as developed, as modern societies, focused inwards. We're tribalising, where politics are becoming personalised and tribalised and all-consuming. And I think maybe the COVID pandemic has exacerbated rather than broken that apart. How do you see... how do you analyse that? What's your analysis of the way society is at the moment in this hyper-politicisation that we're living within? And how do we break out of it? How do societies become more participatory?
I'm glad you asked that. So this year is the 20th anniversary since of the publication of a book called Bowling Alone. And I don't know if anybody watching this presentation read Bowling Alone, but when it came out 20 years ago, it's a book by a Harvard sociology professor named Robert Putnam, who identified the bowling alone phenomenon, which is the decline of civic participation in America in that case, but it's true in every Western society. So people are still very active, but when they engage in activities, they do so not in an organized fashion, not with our fellow citizens, but alone. And so we have much less civic engagement today. We had much less civic engagement in the year 2000 than we had in the 1950s, and now it has declined further. And now we are seeing the results of it. It's not just some sort of abstract observation. Okay, people are not as engaged today as they were back then. Today we are seeing the results of it, because if you don't engage with your fellow citizens, then you are more likely to think ill of them, you are more likely to attack them on social media or not to engage with them in person. And what holds our society together? It is that civic engagement. And if we don't have it, what are we as societies? We just look islands of different constituencies of age groups, of ethnic groups, of professional groups, of other groups as well, but nothing keeps us or nothing binds us together. And that's extremely dangerous, and that's something that those wishing us harm from within can exploit, and those wishing us harm from without as well.
And indeed, that seems to be what's happening, doesn't it? That propensity that we have for individualising, personalising our politics is become. It means we're doing our enemies' work for them, whether the seed was planted or not. Is there any way of reversing that? How does a society become more civic, more cohesive, more neighbourly, and perhaps reverse the damage that's been done so that it's more outward looking and more resilient and able to deflect these sort of attacks that we've been talking about?
Well, sometimes I think maybe what we need is a big crisis where we really do have to come together. Apparently coronavirus hasn't been big enough, because we're still bigger, not just here in the UK, but in lots of other countries as well. But I think actually, in a strange way, the threats that we are seeing from other countries, so cyber attacks, disinformation, subversive business practices, all of that, I think, could and does create the need for us to come together here at home to protect not just ourselves and our families, but our communities, because we want to maintain this way of life. So I almost think that's an external need for us to step up could also help us come together as a society here in the UK and in other Western countries as well. And well, how would we do that? So something that I've thought about is resilience training for teenagers, so where teenagers between the penultimate and final year of secondary education would be invited to attend resilience training 3 weeks with kids, not just from their schools, or I'm saying kids, teenagers, not just from their schools, but from their wider region, and where they would then meet teenagers from other schools, and they would get the certificate at the end that would then give them additional UCAS points, and if they were going into the labour market, they would qualify them for, or they would qualify for tax credit, and that would be an incentive for them to participate, and it would also help them make these contacts with teenagers from other walks of life, which, despite all the efforts to sort of mix up schools and education, to help kids mix in communities that are different from their own, it just hasn't worked that well, or at least not well enough. And so I think that could contribute to that. And of course, we do need the resilience to know what to do if power goes down, if the internet goes down, if there's a flood, if there's flooding, if there are other natural disasters, and there will be natural disasters because climate change is increasing.
Well, it's all about learning to read maps again, isn't it? And getting a landline at home, you know.
Exactly.
Back to the future.
Exactly. And if the internet or phone lines went down now, would we know how to contact our family? I bet not.
Would we even know the number, because they're on speed dial right now?
Exactly. And so let's say if the phone lines went down, what would we do? And in earthquake zones, they learn what to do, and so Tokyo, San Francisco, and so forth. We can learn that too. It's not that difficult. You just have to trust that the population is a resource and is willing to be empowered rather than to be a passive bystander.
Yeah, but what you're talking about is education. And some serious changes to the curricula as they exist, which is time consuming. Here we are in the midst of a pandemic. Everything is connected, isn't it? The virus came from, allegedly from China, from a wet market, from wild animals that had been illegally trafficked. They come from countries that are in poverty, distressed by climate change and environmental degradation, which exacerbates poverty, water wars, if you like, between villages, between towns, which we know are happening in the African continent and also even in China. These are all, and hunger is these are all individual threats to global security. Taken together, they have shone a light on vulnerabilities that need to be dealt with so that we don't find ourselves in this position again. And one would hope that our societies are developed enough to be able to recognise causes and then deal with the causes. I don't see any dealing with the causes. And we've been in this situation now for almost a year. It emerged in November in Wuhan. We're nearly in November. So is coronavirus an opportunity missed? Has it just been seized upon, the crises that have popped up because of it? Have these been seized upon to further exacerbate political and tribalised differences? Have we missed a chance?
I don't think so, and I think we have to recognise there are differences between different countries. So some countries have managed it better than others, and the ones that have managed it better than others, including Finland and Latvia and New Zealand, everybody's current favourite, they have focused on the coming together of society, and leaders have been very transparent with the public. And I should mention Italy, a complete surprise to most people, but they managed to come together as a society with people doing that part. And I think it comes down to leaders being transparent and not trying to make present it not trying to present the situation as any better than it actually is, and that engenders trust in the decision makers. Because what I think the danger in giving precise instructions about, you're allowed to meet with this many people, and these are your precise instructions in your area. People will rebel in a sense, in the way that teenagers do, that they get instructions from their parents and they'll say, well, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to.
Teenagers will also rebel if they see their parents doing things that they themselves are now telling their teenagers what to do. There is no trust and respect in that sort of a relationship, and that's what we're seeing, I would say, in the UK, where trust in leadership is breaking down. Exactly. Whereas that didn't seem to happen in Italy. There was a very strict adherence and cohesion from the top down and the bottom up.
Exactly, and they wore masks from the very beginning, they meaning the leaders. So I think that again is part of creating this whole of society where we are all we're all coming together for a particular cause. I'm not saying we always have to agree about everything, then we would be some sort of utopia. But in a crisis situation, it is possible. And there will always be doubters, and there will always be people who will rebel against any sort of instructions from the government. But if there is transparency, if there is honesty, and if the public is viewed as a participant in its own right, and if people are given the idea that they can be trusted to do the right thing, they don't have to be given precise instructions, because if leaders tell them, we know that you will do the right thing because it is the right thing to do for yourself and for society, I think we can actually we can handle the next crisis, which will come. We can handle it much better.
You sound like an optimist. Am I right?
I am, because I think we all want to maintain this way of life. We love living here. Lots of people would love to live in our countries, and I think that it's no mystery to us that we here in the West have the best possible life we could possibly have. In a historical perspective, in a geographical perspective, we are incredibly fortunate, and I think it's not too much task of oneself and indeed of others to want to do their part to maintain it.
Well, let's hope that they do. I think it's time for us to have some questions. So thank you very much for the dialogue, the interesting conversation.
Well, thank you.
And I think what I do now is I throw 2 questions. Is that right? By name. So question 1 is coming from Robin Ashby.
Good evening. Good evening. First of all, thank you very much, Noel, for setting this up, and Dr. Elizabeth for coming along and talking to us. I just wonder if we could follow up a little. We have a world situation where our alleged leaders are the ones who allege anything they don't like as fake news, permanent allegations against their internal political opponents, but while cozying up to those who are our strategic opponents. So I wonder about additional practical steps. I mean, I'm fascinated by your suggestion on resilience training for teenagers with UCAS points attached to them. And on a resilience point of view, I still have my old slide rule. But it's practical steps. What else can be done in short order, bearing in mind that the opinion is and actions are shaped by the stuff that people read and hear on social media to an extent which is just incredible to somebody like me who was around the birth of this stuff and said it would never last. So yes, Dr. There's other practical suggestions that you might have to have for us.
So I thank you for that excellent question. I think something that this would not be done by the government, but by news media organizations, is that they could set up surgeries similar to what MPs do in local communities, because a lot of the root of many of the problems that we have is that people don't trust information. They believe mainstream media, which is even now a pejorative term. Who would have thought? Mainstream media is somehow obfuscating, is out to get somebody, or is in cahoots with somebody. And actually, I think most journalists work honestly, and not the fewest are like the ones who ran that supposed Hunter Biden school. So what if news organizations would set up regular surgeries in communities around the country, discuss with local with people from the local community what they are thinking of writing about, and maybe even hearing from people in the local community what they are interested in, and have them even involved in choosing the next day's stories for the newspaper. I think that could restore an enormous degree of, it could restore trust to an enormous degree. Of course, that doesn't solve the problem about politicians acting in an unhelpful way. And I think there, maybe we need a new selection process for MPs. Or maybe we need a new party. That's obviously not very easy in the first past the post system. But what about casting the net a bit wider for new MPs? And I must say, I don't have a position on Scottish independence, but it seems that the Scottish, well, the SNP gets a sort of a very energetic group of relatively young people to run for their, or stand for their seats. And that may be because they are new to Westminster, relatively new to Westminster. I don't know what the reason is, but there are engaged people sort of outside the traditional party system who I'm sure could be incentivized to stand for both Labour and the Conservatives, and indeed for the Lib Dems. I think they may be in particularly strong need of maybe of new faces.
Well, the death of the small town newspaper has certainly
absolutely
had a big impact on communities.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
especially rural communities, I would imagine. And
so if you live in a well, not just in a rural community, in a smaller town,
Yeah.
you are very likely not to have a local newspaper anymore.
And you feel more and more remote from the decision-making process.
From the decision-making and from your fellow residents, right? Because that used to be, I remember myself, I grew up in the countryside, that was a credible and trusted source of information.
Yeah, indeed, and people felt involved in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question is from Christopher Samuel. Hello, Christopher.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for having me. Most interesting to hear what you had to say. I'm afraid that I feel that, certainly in the UK, but generally, the population do not know what the threat is on defence and security. They're not kept up to date by often governments, and there's a gagging order on UK people in actually talking to the press. Therefore, the things that are reported are inaccurately reported. And as a result, I suspect that the media and communications organisation and the politicians have very little knowledge of actually what the dangers are out there. You can't get that from your local government and your local people. And if your own armed forces aren't allowed to talk to you, which they aren't, you'll never find out. In fact, there was a little survey done by SAFA about putting ex-service people into new posts, and the interviewee was asked what he thought about the armed forces caliber of people, and he said it was excellent. And he was then asked, what do they do? And the answer, he said, was, I haven't a clue. Until we can actually highlight beyond cyber and actually what the people on the front line actually have to go through, we're not going to get very much further, and we're losing the battle.
Do you have a question for Elizabeth, Christopher?
Yes. How do you get round the educating or informing the media? And she mentioned the children that she was talking about. Would you have it in the national curriculum?
Thank you very much for that question. So I have been told by MPs that it's extremely difficult to change the curriculum. So I've abandoned that idea. But so how do we? What you're articulating is the civil-military divide in our society, and the fact that our armed forces are extremely good, but people have no idea what they do for a living, and they respect them, they almost worship them. And what was it? A recent British Legion survey I saw showed that 89% of people think that UK armed forces do a good job, and 69% of them don't know what it is they do. So they love seeing them parade for trooping the colour and so forth, and they hear what that they've been to Afghanistan, but what do they do on a daily basis? People have no idea. And frankly, this is bound to be the case in the country where there's no national service. I don't think, just before anybody starts thinking here, I don't think national service or mandatory national service would be a good idea for this country, and indeed not for most other countries either, simply because the armed forces don't need those thousands upon thousands of young people. But that system in the countries that had it then created an incredibly well-informed population where, I mean, my father and 5 younger brothers all did military service. Only one of them went into the armed forces as a career, but they are all informed citizens as a result. What can we do short of that? I think the National Defence Course that Finland has is a fantastic model. So it's a course, a 3-week residential course for rising leaders in all parts of society, so armed forces obviously, but politics, business, academia, media, all parts of society. If you're a rising leader, you get nominated by somebody senior in your organization. If you're lucky, you get selected, and you attend this 3-week course about the foundations of national security in Finland, the threats, and then there are obviously various refresher courses, but what that then results in or generates is the critical mass of leaders in society who know about national security, think about national security, and who obviously are able to connect with their fellow participants in that course.
And debate it.
Exactly, yeah. And debated, as you say, Lynn. So that's something for the let's say more established members of society, or somewhat older than the 18-year-olds I was describing earlier. For younger people, or for sort of on a larger scale, I think it would be useful just to invite them to various military installations, obviously not to see anything classified and not to see any shooting, but just to see what it looks like, because these super bases we have now are so forbidding, and most people never interact with any soldiers. And it used to be different when there were regiments in every town, and then that was restructured. But most of us just never have a conversation with a soldier or officer. How would we know what it is they do? And that creates unnecessary fear of the armed forces, or worship of the armed forces on the other hand. So, but they are just regular citizens like us. So regular open houses for select groups from the local community, I think, would go a long way. And if I may just mention very quickly, the US Navy had, or may still have, a program called Sea to Carrier, where CEOs, so C-level people, were invited to visit aircraft carriers, and as you can imagine, they loved it. And so totally ordinary, well, not ordinary, because no CEO is ordinary, but not the usual sort of defense contractor CEOs only, but CEOs from all parts of society. And I think that could help create a better, I think we lost you there, could help create a better understanding, help bridge the civil military divide.
Let the public play with the kit.
Exactly. Yeah.
I know I like to do that.
Yeah. Well, and also for those of us, and there are many in our societies who are uneasy about the military, just for them to see, experience what the armed forces do in civil contingencies, and even in military situations where it's not just the infantry, because as I think it may be a surprise to many members of the public to know that actually many members of the armed forces rarely carry a weapon. I mean, or rarely use a weapon, I should say, because they are in administrative roles and they are medics or what have you. All of that, I mean, how are they supposed to know if they never meet a soldier?
But when they do get involved, for instance, at the Olympics after the G4S debacle, it was a very smooth and enjoyable process, I believed at the time, because it was the military who were doing the security rather than a security company. You see it with the Indian military at international and national airports in India. It's the military who do the security. The logistics, the COVID logistics that were handled by the British military over recent weeks and months. So there is an opportunity for people, rare as it may be, or under duress as it may be, for the public to see the military in action. But yeah, I think you're right. It's not enough, and they don't understand.
Yeah. And if I may just give one more example, in Germany, the Defence Secretary has just introduced, or actually earlier this year introduced, a fantastic scheme where all serving, both active duty and reservist members of the Bundeswehr, so the German armed forces, if they wear uniform, they get to travel on public transport for free. And so I know it wouldn't be possible in this country because there is a risk that, well, because of the long-standing risk of IRA attacks, which caused the government to abandon a similar policy back, I think, in the 70s, was it the 80s? I would hope that the threat scenario has changed to the point where members of the armed forces don't have to worry about IRA attacks. But it may not work in this country as a result of that history. But in other countries, it does work. And so in Germany, you've now got Bundeswehr soldiers traveling on trains everywhere, and people can see that they're just normal people. You can even have a conversation with them.
Yeah. Thank you. Our next question is from Noel.
Okay, this feels like television. I'm actually asking two questions for the price of one. one question from Emma Moore from the Sustainability Circle, and Lana Howard, and their really combined question: do you think relative peace and prosperity has contributed to a lack of community, and what can bind us together short of a wartime situation? And we're thinking of Brexit, no deal, pandemic. So, and we do have 3 questions to go, 2 online and hopefully 1 from the David Lloyd George room. We will have to keep it to 1 minute tight each question. Ladies.
Sorry, I must say, you were so engaging that now I've already forgotten the first part of the question.
Who would take advantage of pandemics, Brexit, no deal?
Who would? Well, we have already seen who would, and we have seen it in Italy, where, as you may remember, in the first couple of weeks of the crisis, Italy was the first country to be hit in Europe, and it was hit badly, and it sent out the equivalent of an SOS to its fellow European Union member states. There is an EU crisis hub that handles such requests, and if you need something, you can ask for other EU member states to send supplies or personnel, whatever it is you are asking for. Italy asked for that. Not a single country sent them anything. And what happened? Russia and China then sent them things. So sent medics, sent supplies. As it turns out,
traditionally,
as it turns out, Italy had to pay for a lot of those Chinese supplies. So China was not a particularly generous donor at all. In fact, I call them a bad Samaritan. But that's what happened. And so I think that's worth considering when we think about what could happen to the UK. I'm not saying, as I think I mentioned earlier, that Russia is behind everything that goes wrong. We're perfectly capable of a lot of that ourselves. But what we should think about how we the message that we send to the world about how we're able to run our country, and if we send a message to the world that actually we're totally helpless and it's a complete chaos, then we can be sure that somebody will exploit it.
Yeah, surprise. Our next question we're throwing to Marshall Kent. Are you there, Marshall?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can now. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is to Elizabeth: will the current proliferation in conspiracy theories such as 5G and QAnon inspire and result in serious political violence and terrorist attacks in the UK?
Have you got your crystal ball handy?
That's an excellent question. And again, QAnon and 5G conspiracy theories are just another expression of what we discussed earlier, which is the fact that everybody feels that they can attack others, spread any sort of information, and because nobody feels responsible for the common good. What is the common good? It's what we all, it's the society in which we live, to which we should all contribute. And if everybody feels at liberty to attack our society, it's not going to survive. And I think that's what we are seeing. I think most reasonable people supporting or believing in QAnon would probably, if they sat back and sort of thought about it for a moment, they would probably conclude it's bonkers. But it's so exciting to maybe to be able to think outside your own boring life and connect with others, and especially now when things feel pretty hopeless. A new religion, as it were, a sort of fake religion, may give people hope. And as you said, such conspiracy theories don't just stop in people's heads, they lead people to take dangerous action, and we have seen it with 5G. Here in the UK, we have had a string of attacks, not just on 5G antennas, but on 5G engineers, with QAnon and mask protesters, anti-mask protesters. They seem to be converting now. So we've got this sort of crazy collection of people who, some are QAnon, within QAnon, QAnon, it somehow melds together with anti-mask people, with the far right, far left,
anti-immigration.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Groups that ordinarily would have nothing together, they somehow gather in this group, and when they gather, of course, they wear no masks, which then puts themselves at risk and whoever they may encounter on their way back from those protests. So it's extremely dangerous. But again, it's this idea that I'm only here for myself and it's only about me. And I wish we could stop navel gazing on our societies. And I think if we stepped back to see that there are bigger things that concern us, not just how we feel about ourselves and our maybe possibly boring lives, then we would be able to come together. And I wish that leaders in our society would call upon the public to take that step, to play that part for society and be part of the solution. Because if not, maybe it just came to my mind, maybe David Attenborough is the one who has to communicate that message. The one universally respected member of society we have here. So I'll make that case next.
He's 98. He's seen a lot. Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you. Thanks for your question, Marshall. Our next question is from Ilada Nija. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Are you there?
Hi, good evening, Eliza. Hi, thank you so much for a very interesting and timely conversation. I'm joining this evening from Brussels. So recent trends have shown that hacking attempts tend to stem from regions of the world often labelled as undemocratic. If the governments are to be held accountable for their actions, considering often senior figures in the leadership are involved, what can be done to mediate the risk of negatively impacting or potentially isolating the citizens of those countries, considering the various initiatives currently in place to help foster democratization? How can we prevent turning our backs on them if we are to hold their governments to account?
Especially given that we're seeing UN agencies being taken over by autocrats.
Yes, so you're saying we need more transparency from leaders, and but that transparency may lead to more cynicism, or did I get that
Yes,
wrong?
yeah, exactly. Transparency, but also holding governments to account, but at the same time not neglecting the citizens of those countries and maintaining an open dialogue with them, which is very crucial in these testing times. Yeah,
well, so yeah, we won't like many things that we hear. That if we were to, if politicians and other decision makers were completely transparent, we wouldn't like many of the things we heard. And in fact, it would be like reading Private Eye every single day of the year, and it would leave us very cynical. But I think it may also inspire people to be part of trying to improve society, because they get the idea that actually politicians are not that much better than them, and in fact they could do a better job themselves. And so I think instead of engendering cynicism, it would engender activism. At least I hope that would be the case. I think maybe where there is the most hope, it's in distinct areas. So climate change, for example, is one area where rather than engendering cynicism, I think transparency could and is already leading to people becoming more involved in Fridays for Future is obviously one demonstration of that, one example of that. Yeah, I guess there is a risk. I mean, if we were to encourage politicians to become more transparent, that they would themselves suffer the consequences, and so as a result, they would be very reluctant to do so. I don't have an answer to that.
But thank you for the question, nevertheless.
Thank you.
Always more food for thought. I think that we're going to have to wrap up. We're running out of time. We've had a lot of stimulating questions, for which thank you very much to the audience. You do strike me as being an eternal optimist. Well, maybe not eternal, but given everything that you study, everything that we've discussed, everything that's going on, you still seem to think, I have moments when I don't, that we can pull ourselves out of the the big mess that we've got ourselves into. My belief is that one follows from the other, and we are in the COVID situation because of everything else that has come before it. And your optimism that we can educate, inform and believe in people in order to recalibrate, if you like, and recohese societies makes me very glad that you have that faith in your fellow man.
My son always says, well, you always think about everything that could go wrong. And but I do think about what we could do about it. And so if I can end on that optimistic note, I think that's the message I'd like to send. And I'd like to thank everybody for asking such insightful questions. I'll go home and think about that last one.
Well done. And so what I'm going to do now is throw over to Inderjeet Singh Najjar for our vote of thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What an inspirational evening. I have been absolutely stumped by this, if I can use the cricket analogy, that I think I'll be focused in a few seconds. I promise I've had nothing but water to drink this evening. I mean, a few things struck me this evening. I mean, words like harm from within and outside, disinformation, the role that's played in our Brexit referendum here and the US election 2016, and the ones that are coming down the line in the next 2 weeks. And we don't know what's going to transpire out of that particular process. And the key one that really struck me was resilience, and our young people, the role that they need to play in holding and the glue that needs to hold our society together. I think that's really powerful. And in particular, I can share your frustration, Elizabeth, in relation to the national curriculum, where there is no way you can influence that particular set of agreements that exist within government. And well, if they're doing anything, they're stripping away things like modern languages and other things from the national curriculum rather than adding to it. But the final point really is that around building trust in our society. If young people are going to play a role, resilience is the key to that. We need to empower society generally. And I think your kind of quite a clear thesis that the army, the armed forces need to be visible within our society and our communities. It's non-existent. When you have the likes of our existing, well, current government threatening you to use the armed forces to enforce the COVID restrictions, doesn't bode well in engendering trust within society and the role that the armed forces play to protect us every day, every second of our lives here. I mean, I share your optimism. I think I look at the glass half full rather than half empty. And, you know, what I take away from this is that there is a hell of a lot of inspiration rather than doom and gloom. COVID-19 may be an event that may or may not leave some lasting scars, but nonetheless, I think it's going to leave something behind, which is about building our society together, and it's given us an opportunity to do that. And I think it's been a wonderful interactive session, and I congratulate Noel on his inaugural event. And I'm very pleased on behalf of the General Committee to have witnessed this at first hand. And thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Elizabeth.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.